The term the banality of evil was popularized by this book, which was written by a Jewish philosopher who attended the trial of Adolf Eichmann. And Eichmann was a Nazi technocrat in charge of arranging the train rides that moved the Jewish population in World War II to the death camps. That was his role. And her depiction of him was basically that he was so focused on his job and his role inside the Nazi regime that he wasn't really thinking about the broader implications of what he was doing. So the question I'm looking at in this video and in a series I'm starting on this topic is how might the modern day version of the banality of evil differ from Eichmann's version in World War II? And in particular, might the modern day version be more subtle, hard to detect, and more insidious? And the word insidious seemed like it applied, but I had to look it up and I think it does apply, so let me read you the definition here. Insidious means working or spreading harmfully in a subtle or stealthy manner, intended to entrap, treacherous, beguiling but harmful, alluring. With Adolf Eichmann, all he had to do was look up to see that at the end of the train rides he was arranging, people faced their deaths. That was fairly obvious, and you can't really say that he could be completely unaware of that. And yet, in the modern day version of the banality of evil, it's oftentimes way easier to see how somebody might not realize the end impact of the system they're participating in. Many times the people doing the bidding of the system that ends up so destructive, they're so many steps removed from the final destructive behavior of the system that they may not make that connection. Moreover, the way information travels through these institutions that uphold the system distorts that information inherently. Sometimes this information is probabilistic in nature and statistics can be distorted and manipulated in certain ways. People get their perspective on reality, their models of reality from social media, where there is real propaganda at play. That propaganda creates distortions in people's perception. And a lot of times, even when people wake up and realize what they're participating in, what the system they're involved in does, it's not always clear what the right response to that is. Is it to completely back out of the system? Is that even possible? Or are there ways they can operate inside their roles to move something or bend something in a healthier direction? A lot of times these things are way more murky than the case of Adolf Eichmann. So I do want to explore in this video how we could have a banality of evil in our system and what is the nature of that. One way I've been framing this stuff lately is that there's this battle between investigative journalists who uncover some really troubling facts. And this includes things like pesticides and forever chemicals that end up in everyday products. It includes things like social media algorithms that promote outrage and mental illness and addiction. Why did the opioid epidemic last so long, with hospitals regularly prescribing opioids for routine pain? And the question is, why do these investigative journalists make such little headway against these issues they uncover? And one way I frame this is that there are sociopaths on the other side upholding a system that doesn't care about the things the investigative journalists are bringing to light. But most people around the sociopaths are actually good people. Most people upholding the system believe themselves to be participating in a positive role in society. And my question is, why are the sociopaths and those who support them winning out again and again against the investigative journalists? And to understand the depth of reality here, we need to understand these good, well-intentioned people who end up working with the sociopaths against the investigative journalists' findings. What are those people doing? What's motivating them? And this notion of the modern day banality of evil is really us zooming in on the well-intentioned actors on the other side of that battle. First off, what does our side have that the other side does not? And I realize the framing here, our side versus their side, is actually a little bit confusing, especially in the light of the people we're zooming in on in this video, that is the well-intentioned people doing the bidding of the sociopaths. Whose side are they on? And in some ways, in spirit, they are on our side. In practice, they are on the side of the sociopaths. But what do I mean by the two sides? And for me, it really is about we're in a system that has this power to the powerful dynamic. And most people do not support that dynamic. Pretty much the only ones who do are seeking power for power's sake and don't care that the cost of that is destruction of human communities and ecosystems and all of that. And I sometimes refer to that power to the powerful dynamic as the dragon political economy. That's the other side, is that which supports power to the powerful and the dragon political economy. On our side, it's the people who oppose that. It's fairly straightforward. But many people, in fact, to some degree, most people are really straddling the line. In spirit, they're on one side, but in practice, it's almost impossible not to be operating on behalf of the other side. So how do we contend with that? And these two sides are not symmetric. In particular, our side has virtue while the other side cannot. Our side has honesty, integrity, courage, generosity, etc. Those things can be cultivated and lived out on our side. Whereas the other side cannot have those values, because you take the value of honesty, which is sort of foundational. If they were honest about what they were actually after, most people would not support them. Power to the powerful is something that most people oppose. So it requires a dishonesty, it requires a lack of integrity, and yet there is an actual power in integrity, an actual power in honesty. When people live in a way that is upholding good values, other people trust them, and that brings them a real power. The implication for the other side is if they want some of that power that goes along with having integrity, they will have to hijack it from our side and sort of bend that integrity power according to their own interests. And I do think that is some of the strategic behavior at play in our system. Now, if we apply this to the banality of evil, to the good people supporting the sociopaths, we pretty immediately run up against a problem, which is, what does it mean for many of these people to have integrity? So let's imagine that one of them is in one of these roles of power, and they suddenly wake up to some of the things that the investigative journalists have been trying to bring forward. They wake up to the connection between their roles and their decisions and some of these bad behaviors of our system. What is the right thing to do at that point? What is the action of integrity in response to that waking up? And some people might say, okay, the correct response is to back out of the system and just live off the grid and not participate at all. Others might say, actually, maybe there's a possibility that the right decision is to stay inside that role as somebody who has woken up and to act against the system through that role in ways that are perhaps strategic and subtle and that are responding to the real on-the-ground conditions that that person lives within. Both of those are real possibilities for a response that has integrity of someone in those roles. And one problem I see on our side of the battle is that we will oftentimes treat those people sitting in those roles who are genuinely participating in the system, we treat them as enemies. Those people who have woken up should be allies, but are often treated as enemies. And it's that division, it's that enmity between people who can't see their on-the-ground reality, who can't see what's going on in their head and heart, who are acting against those people inside the system who have woken up. With all of that in mind, I want to lay out where I need to go in a series on the modern day banality of evil. And the first of these is that I need to talk about polarization as a strategy. Polarization is essentially serving a divide and conquer strategy that keeps our side from being able to effectively act against the sociopaths. This is particularly difficult because everybody believes that the other side of a polarized divide is under the spell of propaganda, but that their side is not. And in fact, most of the people in these roles, most of these banality of evil types of people, well-intentioned actors, have that belief. For them to actually wake up to what they are participating in would require hearing and understanding people on the other side of a polarized divide. So yeah, I will have to do some videos on polarization to accurately cover modern day banality of evil. Second, I will need to do a video on models as evil, because a lot of times what we feel misunderstood and degraded. And that is not coming from people looking at us and seeing what we're actually doing and how we're behaving in the world in our real context. And usually the misunderstand and degrade strategy is coming from somebody's model that is projected onto us without any attention to our real world context. And yet we can't get by without models. We need models to think about how our system is operating, since we can't see our system from our vantage point. How do we navigate that? And then I'm going to need to do a video on information moats. How is it that some of these people who sit in roles of power do not hear a lot of the information that the investigative journalists uncover. In fact, that is completely not on their radar. And it's based on the way information flows through social media and inside these institutions and in communities where in-group and out-group dynamics are deeply influencing their perception of reality. So information moats will be another topic I hope to eventually cover. The distortion in people's thinking and behavior that happens in all three of these realms, the polarization, the mental models, and the information moats, that can be traced back to distortions in people's salience frames. So if we want to understand how good people end up enabling evil things, we're going to have to understand how power can bend people's salience frames, bend people's perspective on reality to its will. So to do that, we're going to have to ask the question, what is a salience frame? And it's going to have two parts to this concept, where the first is the salience frame determines how big or small something is in somebody's worldview. So I often use the imagery of the lens of a camera, where you can have things that are in sharp focus at the center of the frame. You can have things that take up a lot of space on the frame. Here, once again, what's on the frame is what's inside your worldview. But with a camera, you can also have things on the fuzzy edges of your frame where there is an awareness of them, but it's not a clear or focused awareness. And then, of course, you can have things that are outside of the frame of the camera that are not even on the lens, that are not even entering into somebody's worldview. For somebody who has pesticides large on their salience frame and in sharp focus, that person is thinking about pesticides a lot whenever they walk through the grocery store. The concept of pesticides being in the breakfast cereal or in the bread is sort of something that occurs to them, something that they sort of have a revulsion to, that just shapes their experience in the supermarket. Whereas somebody for whom pesticides is sort of on the fuzzy edges of their salience frame, they're aware that pesticides harm the environment, harm human health. They've had conversations where that comes up, but maybe when they're walking through the grocery store, most of the time that just doesn't even enter their mind. And then for some people, they've never really heard the arguments about pesticides. This is not something that's a topic of conversation in their social circles, so it's just not on their worldview radar. So the first part of salience frame is how big is something in your worldview. The second part of a salience frame is how heavily something drives your behavior. And you can think of the pesticide example. Actually, for someone for whom pesticides is a large part of their worldview, actually, they may avoid certain aisles of the grocery store. They may seek out local farmers and buy a lot of their food from co-ops or local farmers. Their entire behavior frame and how they act in the world is actually driven by how big pesticides are on their salience frame. With the person who has pesticides on the fuzzy edges of their salience frame, they may occasionally avoid a certain food if they've heard somebody talking about that food having pesticides or whatnot. So occasionally it will pull on their behavior, but for the most part, it's not a big force driving what they do when they buy food. And of course, if something's not on your salience frame, it's not going to pull on your behavior at all when you interact in the supermarket. Now, with that definition of salience in mind, let's first look at salience in the case of Adolf Eichmann and the Nazi death camps, at least briefly, and then we'll look at more the modern-day banality of evil in our three scenarios, our polarization, our models as evil, and our information moats, and the way salience shows up in each of those three cases. Now, what was in sharp focus on Eichmann's salience frame was his job. And during the Holocaust, his job was organizing the train rides that took the Jewish populations to the death camps. That was his job. His focus was on doing his job inside his organization and his responsibilities. What was not on his salience frame was the effect of what he was doing on the Jewish population. What was not on his salience frame was his role in history. Now, even before there was a Holocaust, he was still involved in the Nazi regime doing something fairly similar. His job in the early part of the war before the Holocaust was to move the Jewish population out of Austria, again on trains. And what he was focused on was his role compared to somebody with a similar role in Germany. What were his percentages of people that he could get out of Austria versus the percentages of Jews that someone in his role in the Nazi regime in Germany got out of Germany? And that comparison, that statistic that focused his attention on what is he accomplishing according to the game that's being set up for him, that was in sharp focus on his salience frame. Now, one big question here is, why are the moral questions about the atrocities that he is enabling through his job, why are those not on his salience frame? And one way she has in this book of answering that question is by focusing on his experience where he actually let go of any moral qualms he had. And this happened at the Wannsee Conference, where initially when he heard about the Holocaust, which they were calling the final solution, that was their euphemism for the Holocaust. And he initially found out about that and was put out and kind of upset about it for a little while until the Wannsee Conference put all of that out of his mind. So the question is, how did that happen? And the Wannsee Conference was a gathering of Nazi officials. In fact, Eichmann was actually the lowest ranked Nazi official at the meeting. And the purpose of the meeting was not to decide, should we or should we not do this? Is this moral? The purpose was to figure out, how do we implement it? It had already been decided at a higher level in the Nazi regime, and this group of officials were essentially in charge of deciding, how do you handle the difficult cases of half Jews and quarter Jews, and what are the methods of killing? Their decision was not around should it or should it not be done morally. It was around how to do it, given that somebody else had already decided. And people's salience frames tends to focus on what they actually have agency over, what they can control. Things that are beyond a person's control tend to fall to the side of one's salience frame. That's something that somebody else decided. I can't really do anything about that, or at least I think I can't do anything about it. So it moves to the side of a person's salience frame when they feel they have no agency over it. And the fact that this meeting focused on implementation and took the decision about whether or not to do it for granted, that fact sort of directed everybody's salience frame in a particular way. And at the meeting, Eichmann basically felt, oh, who is he to have moral questions of his own if everyone around him seems to be thinking that the moral questions had been settled or had been determined elsewhere? And he kind of gave up his moral agency at the meeting. And the purpose of meetings at work does tend to be to orient people's salience frame, to get their focus around what the organization wants them to do. And part of the deal here has to do with attitude, because our salience frames tend to be determined by the attitude of those around us. Do those around us think this is important and meaningful as a place to focus our attention? Or do the people around us seem to think, oh, that's not really something we should all be focusing on, that's not worth our time, that's not relevant, that's not what good people like us spend our attention doing? So we absorb our attitudes from those around us, and those attitudes direct our salience frames. That's what happened with Adolf Eichmann at the Wannsee Conference, and it pretty much permanently moved his moral questions and his moral qualms about the Holocaust off of his salience frame, only to the fuzzy edges. So are there any parallels today when it comes to modern-day salience frames and modern-day banality of evil? Let's look briefly at the three realms I've identified, where we might start with polarization, and the in-group, out-group dynamics with polarization are actually playing a really big strategic role in bending our system toward a power to the powerful direction. And salience is really the biggest part of constructing in-group and out-group dynamics, because when we look at the out-group, their bad traits, their character flaws, the selfish motives that attract them to that group, that is what becomes big and in the front and center and sharp focus in our salience frame for them. And their good side and their potential, that is on the fuzzy edges or very small in the salience frame. And of course, the reverse is true for the N-group. For the N-group, we focus on our positive qualities and on our potential to contribute positively to societal well-being. That means that our motivational energy toward the N-group is to empower and uplift the N-group, whereas our motivational energy directed at the out-group is to disempower. And of course, anytime you sense that somebody wants to disempower you and is directing creative adversarial energy at you, you're going to fear them, you're going to direct your attention in that direction to try to disempower them. So it creates this dynamic where both of the groups are kind of trying to destroy each other's ability to act in the world. Now, how exactly that feeds the power to the powerful dynamic, I'm going to save that discussion for a different day. What I'm saying for today is that the salience frames are going to play a big role in the formation and in the energy between in-groups and out-groups. Next, how do salience frames relate to models as evil? And there's a lot to this one, but the one thing I'll say here is the way numbers and statistics can be used to direct people's attention, to direct their salience frames. With Eichmann, the metrics of his success at moving the Jewish population out of Austria focused his attention and directed his efforts in ways that would align with the purposes of the Nazi regime. And metrics of this sort are maybe more important today in directing people's salience frames. Those statistics may seem more real and concrete than the fuzzy human impacts that cannot be measured. And of course, statistics can be used strategically to direct or misdirect people's attention. And then finally, how does salience relate to information moats? Because a lot of times people sitting in positions of power who make these real important decisions, it's not that they never hear the things the investigative journalist is bringing forth. It's not that that information has never crossed their path. It just doesn't really sink in. It's a little bit like in one ear and out the other. And that does have to do with their salience frame. If nobody around them is paying attention to that information, or if people around them have a certain attitude about that information that is dismissive, then people tend to absorb that attitude and absorb the salience frame of those around them. And this relationship between attitude and salience frame is going to be key. If everybody around you is saying, oh, don't worry about that, or that's not that important, or that's beyond your control, don't focus your attention on that, then people just tend to absorb that without thinking too much about it. If you liked this video, my video on Adolf Eichmann and the Banality of Evil in Hannah Arendt's book will probably interest you. It does a much deeper dive of his case. And you also might like my video on the investigative journalists, which touches similar topics.